There's this saying in the Polish art of criminal investigation, so to speak, that the killer is always in the first volume of the case files. These words were said by Maciej Szuba, who used to be the chief of the entire Poznań police department. Back in his days, he was one of the best police officers in his region, fighting mostly crimes related to mafia activity. Although Szuba's observation doesn't hold true in every case, in Miłoszyce and many others, it turned out to be exactly right. My name is Alex, and this is Poland Unveiled. If you're listening to this, it means that you're an incredibly patient person, given how much time we had to wait for each part of the Miłoszyce case. Today we have finally reached part 3, out of 4 as it turned out, because I had so much material that I had to divide what was supposed to be part 3 into 2 parts. Don't worry though, part 4 is ready and it will be uploaded very soon. So we're almost done, and I have to tell you that I'm quite relieved. The case cost me a lot of work, time, and many times left me feeling incredibly emotional, also frustrated, angry, and powerless. And I also kind of wanted to make you feel the same way, because there usually isn't much we can do for the victims of the crimes I talk about here, other than try to feel what they felt and try to imagine what they went through, also their families. We hope that it never happens to us, and we do everything in our power to make sure we keep ourselves safe and appreciative of what we have. What we can do is also simply remember the victims of the crimes they talk about here. And explaining the title of this episode, I'm saying victims because apart from Małgosia, who undoubtedly is the main victim, let's not forget about others, like her parents, who never got over what happened, never fully processed the grief, never stopped fighting for justice, and because of that, never had a chance to live a normal life. The same probably goes for Małgosia's baby sister. Of course, the next victim we can't forget about is Tomasz Komenda, a man accused of many crimes he had not committed, arrested at the age of 23 and then sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. In jail, he was treated like no human being should ever be treated. And I don't mean the general discomfort of being in prison, being taken out of your normal life and away from your family, which is intentional, and that is the way it's supposed to be. But what I mean is how he was treated by his cellmates. It was a mental and physical hell, and Komenda's family was scared for his life the entire time he spent behind bars. He was beaten and most likely sexually abused, although about the latter he never really wanted to talk. And nobody felt sorry for him, except for his family, since Komenda was convicted in the court of law, after a lengthy trial, and it truly seemed to the rest of the world that justice was served. We already know here that it wasn't true, that Komenda's conviction was the outcome of pressure put on the police and the prosecution, mixed with bad will and the lack of desire to dig deeper. Because let's not forget that the investigators, and also judges, knew that there was more than one perpetrator, and yet, nobody cared about looking for the rest of them. Everyone was happy that someone got convicted, that the pressure was finally off. And this is how years went by. Newspapers stopped writing about this case, people finally stopped talking about it, everybody moved on, well, except for the families of the victims. And this is how we're getting to a turning point of this story. So unexpected, so movie-like, that it's hard to believe that it actually happened. On that note, please don't ever forget when listening to this story that it actually truly happened. That it's not a movie. Although, spoiler, a movie would be made about the Miłoszyce case, but for that, everybody had to wait until 2020. For now though, it's 2010 in our story. A new family is moving to Miłoszyce. Apart from it being the place where one of the most gruesome and media-covered crimes in Poland happened, Miłoszyce is also quite a peaceful village, relatively close to Wrocław. And for those who work in the city but don't want to pay horrendous money for a flat there, or want to live in a more suburban area and still be able to get to work on time, Miłoszyce is a great place to live. Which is why Remigiusz Korejwo, Remik for friends and family, decided around 2010 that he wanted to move in there. Well, actually, from what I read, he wasn't exactly the person who chose the location, it was more of a coincidence, but long story short, Remik ended up building a house in Miłoszyce and hiring the locals to help him with construction. Why am I telling you all this, you probably wonder? Who cares about the random guy building a house in Miłoszyce, of all places? Well, it's because Remik wasn't really a random guy, but a criminal department police officer. And as soon as the locals found out who Remik was, they started to bring up the murder in conversations, and it seemed as though the people of Miłoszyce did not consider the case to have been quite resolved. Remigiusz Korejwo isn't with the police anymore simply because he retired. But around 2010, he was one of the best in the Lower Silesia region, even though he was new to the police force. Before the police, he worked as a border guard, as one of the special forces officers in the 90s. As I mentioned many times before, the 90s in Poland were a golden era for the Polish mafia, and they often smuggled stuff like alcohol and drugs. And Remik's job was to track those groups down and dismantle them, which was risky, dangerous, and quite hardcore. Remik had always wanted to be a police officer, but he couldn't. And it's because there used to be this rule in the Polish police, I don't know if it applies anywhere else, that a police officer cannot be shorter than 1.76 meters. And Remik was shorter. So at the time when he applied, his application was denied, regardless of his qualifications, only due to his height. This rule was eventually removed, and in 2009, Remik managed to transfer himself to the police. Initially, he worked in a prevention unit, and then he got moved to the criminal department, which was what he had always wanted to do. His first case also happened to be his first big success with the police, because Remik and his two other colleagues managed to capture a rapist who had been terrorizing women of Wrocław for years. When they finally got him, it was more or less at the time when Remik was working on his house in Miłoszyce, which made him think, knowing the criminal history of the rapist he had just caught, that maybe this guy was also responsible for hurting Małgosia Kwiatkowska in 1997. The rapist from Wrocław was caught in 2010 but had been active since the 90s, so about 2 decades. As it turned out, raping women was his only job and his entire life purpose. So because of the serial rapist from Wrocław, and the fact that people from Miłoszyce started to talk with Remik about the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, Remik decided to get the files on the Miłoszyce case and maybe start digging a bit to check the timeline of events and figure out if his theory makes any sense. I mean the theory that the Wrocław rapist had anything to do with the Miłoszyce murder. Remik went to the chief of police for the Lower Silesia voivodeship to share his discovery, to try and advise the chief that DNA from Miłoszyce should be compared with the DNA of the freshly caught serial rapist from Wrocław, but the reaction he got to that idea was weird, to say the least. The chief of police didn't even want to hear about it. He said that the Miłoszyce case had been resolved and closed, the murderer was behind bars, and there was no need to compare anyone's DNA. The interesting thing is that the said chief of police was a part of the original 1997 investigation of the Miłoszyce case. He wasn't the lead investigator, the aggressive one who liked beating his witnesses and fantasized about outdoor sex in the middle of winter, but it was his colleague who, I believe, was also present during most of the interrogations. So he said no. He didn't want to reopen the case. Just to keep things in order here, I have not found information in my sources that the serial rapist from Wrocław was later in any way linked with the Miłoszyce case. It seemed that Remik wanted to check this because the timeline more or less checked out, but there was no further evidence to support this theory. As of now, there is no proof that this guy was responsible for Małgosia's death, and my instinct is that he wasn't. First of all, the rapist only attacked in Wrocław. He had his favorite neighborhoods, and for about 2 decades, he only attacked there, which was later confirmed in the diaries that he kept, because he meticulously listed and, in his own way, described each and every attack on a woman that he ever carried out. It was terrifying to see. You can go and watch a documentary on this case on Netflix. I'll link it down below. It seems that no attack like the one on Małgosia was listed in the rapist's diary, which of course doesn't mean that it never happened and that he wasn't a perpetrator. However, his MO was different from what happened to Małgosia. The rapist wasn't as brutal as Małgosia's killers. He didn't bite, which was very specific to Małgosia's case. He also used condoms, whereas in the Miłoszyce case, sperm was found all over Małgosia's clothes. The last thing is that the rapist had nothing to do with Miłoszyce or Jelcz, where Małgosia lived. As I said, he only attacked in Wrocław. And to my best knowledge, he also never killed any of his victims. He was 100% a disgusting person who should be locked up for life, but at the same time, he wasn't considered and was never called a sadist. In case you are wondering what happened with him, he got sentenced to 15 years in prison, which absolutely blew my mind given that he raped about 100 women. Fortunately, once he served his time, he wasn't left free because psychologists alerted that he was such a disturbed person that he would be a danger to other people. So he was put in a facility called the National Center for the Prevention of Antisocial Behavior. If you don't mind, I'd like to introduce you to the story and the idea of creating such a place. If you're not interested, that's okay. Please feel free to skip to the timestamp that I'm gonna put in the info box. So just like in many other countries, we had a few cases of particularly disgusting and dangerous criminals, charged with multiple brutal rapes and murders, often pedophiles, who could only be sentenced for a certain number of years in prison, depending on a criminal code that was in use at the time when those people were active, and then tried and sentenced for their crimes. The most notorious example would be Mariusz Trynkiewicz, a man who in 1988 raped and murdered 4 teenage boys. He was initially sentenced to the death penalty because the criminal code that was in force at the time allowed that. However, it was also a moment when the criminal code was getting changed, and the death penalty for Trynkiewicz was, under the updated criminal code, replaced with 25 years imprisonment. It's because the life sentence had not been reintroduced to the criminal code yet. So, having been sentenced lawfully to only 25 years, Trynkiewicz was to leave prison and be a free man again about 2013 or 15. And nobody wanted that, because Trynkiewicz was a known pedophile and a murderer who warned everyone during his trial that if he ever got out of prison, he would rape and kill again because, as he said, it's stronger than him. So a heated debate in the Polish parliament started on what to do in a situation like this. What to do with people who are dangerous to society. We can be 100% sure that they will go and kill again once out of prison, but keeping them in jail would be unlawful since their sentences end at some point and they have not committed any new crimes yet. So this is how a new law was implemented that was called An Act on How to Proceed with People with Mental Disorders Who Cause Danger to the Life, Health, or Sexual Freedom of Other People, which was too long of a title, so the media shortened it to the Beast Law. The Beast Law applies to people sentenced to 25 years in prison or more with diagnosed personality disorders or disorders of sexual preference, and against whom mental health specialists have assessed that they are very likely to commit a serious crime once they're out of prison. And there are 2 options after jail. The ex-con can either be put under surveillance for an unspecified amount of time, or they can be put in an antisocial behavior treatment center that I mentioned before. Regardless of the chosen option, chosen by the court, the potentially dangerous person has their fingerprints and DNA collected and put in the police database along with their mugshot and a short description of their most recent looks. And this is how we circled back to the serial rapist from Wrocław, caught in 2010, because once he served his time, it was last year, 2025, he was still considered so dangerous that the court decided to put him indefinitely in the Antisocial Behavior Treatment Center. And bear in mind that following the Beast Law, his DNA samples were taken and put in the police database, so I believe it was checked whether or not he could be responsible for the death of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. I also still believe that he doesn't fit the profile of the sadistic rapist and murderer from Miłoszyce. So, apologizing for this long digression, I'm getting back to the story of Remik and how he got involved in the Miłoszyce case. Like I said, the reaction he got to his idea of reopening the case and checking a new possible lead was alarming to him. This case bugged him, but he couldn't afford focusing on it, at least not at the time, since his everyday job, his family life, and the construction work on the house kept him constantly occupied for years. But he didn't forget. In 2013, he and his family finally moved to Miłoszyce. And being around people who lived there when the murder happened intensified Remik's curiosity and this unexplainable feeling that something was off with this case. Remik remembered that when the media covered the Miłoszyce murder, it was speculated that the locals were keeping the conspiracy of silence over this case because it was very likely that one of them had hurt Małgosia, and everyone was trying to protect him. But the more Remik got to know those people, the less he believed in the conspiracy. He saw people of Miłoszyce as his neighbors and acquaintances now, people with whom he went to church, who had their own children and lived closely in the community. He couldn't believe that they all would cover for a rapist and a murderer of a 15-year-old girl, a child. So the more Remik thought about it, the more he spoke with people about the case, the more he felt the need to dive into it. There was one more thing that bugged him. Tomasz Komenda was convicted at a very young age, and everyone knew that there were 2, 3, or even 4 attackers at the crime scene. It often happens that when a few people commit a crime together, there is usually one person from the group, a weak link, who breaks down and does a plea deal with the prosecution. They confess and point out their partners in crime because it pretty much always significantly lowers the jail sentence for them. Komenda never did that. Even though he got sentenced for more years than he had lived at the time, he never said who was with him to save himself from 25 years in prison. Also, when Komenda was allowed to try for parole after 15 years spent in jail, he never filed for it. Why? Because to get a parole, he'd have to confess to what he did and say he was truly sorry, that he regretted what he did. Plus, preferably, he should have confessed who was with him that night. And he couldn't have said any of those things, because today we know for sure that he wasn't there. So all this only fueled Remik's curiosity. Despite having to work on his day-to-day responsibilities in the criminal department, Remik started to read into the Miłoszyce case files in his free time. He didn't have access to everything because some parts of those files were classified. I don't know for what reason. I mean, I would understand if they were only classified to the public due to the nature of the crime, pictures that could be found in the files, personal details of the victim and her family. But why classify those files for the police officers too? Including those officers who worked in the criminal department? Having learned as much as I could about this story, I'd still love to sit and chat with the police officers and the prosecutors who investigated this case and ask them about a million questions. But I know that some of them will always be left unanswered, even on purpose, like the one about the crucial information that Remik got, unofficially, around 2016. It was information on the potential killer, but Remik said he would never tell who his informant was, which bothers me a lot. I hate the conspiracy here because this case, more than others, shows that conspiracy could be a blanket for any kind of deception, chicanery, and the general obstruction of true justice. We could see the miserable outcome of secret information given to the police as a result of the operational work, which eventually turned out to be a complete scam and a result of one person's vindictiveness and hatred. I'm talking about Miss Dorota here, and her tip to the police that it was Tomasz Komenda who killed Małgosia Kwiatkowska. So when I first read about the secret informant who somewhere in 2016 went to Remik's house at night to tell me who killed Małgosia, I was like, geez, for once, let's try and be transparent and reasonable here. Because, it smelled like this mysterious operational work from the first investigation. I'm afraid, though, that we'll have to live with the fact that we'll probably never find out who this informant was and why they approached Remik. We have to know, however, that they pointed at the person who, as opposed to Tomasz Komenda, turned out to tick all the boxes when it comes to the psychological profile of the Miłoszyce murderer. And this person was already known to the police. They were interrogated in 1997 and let go. This person was in the, almost proverbial these days, first volume of the case files. And that person's name was Irek, just like he introduced himself to Małgosia and Krzysztof, pretending to be Małgosia's brother and taking her not home, as he claimed, but to the R family's yard where her life ended. Before I tell you exactly who the secret informant pointed at, I'm wondering if any of you noticed this one weird testimony from the first episode of the series. You might have picked up on this very specific information that one of the interrogated men gave to the police when they were questioned about the New Year's Eve night. One of those guys testified that during the disco, he saw a couple having sex on stage, on that little platform for the DJ. He saw this couple, mind you that nobody else at the disco saw that couple too, and he noticed that the girl's tights were down and that she was also wearing red and green striped socks. Małgosia had socks like this on the night she died. Nobody saw a couple having sex on stage. The Alcatraz disco wasn't big, and it was packed. Surely someone else would have seen that couple too. And let's be honest, it would be a big deal. We're talking about a village disco in the 90s. People were much more prudent back then than these days. But only one person noticed the couple having sex publicly and reported it to the police. Reported in detail, because they included the exact pattern on the girl's socks. The socks that happened to be exactly like Małgosia's. Nobody but the murderer could see Małgosia's socks because they were hidden under her tights. Do you remember when I told you how she was dressed at night? Socks first, tights on top. It was cold, her shoes were a bit too big, and she probably didn't want her socks to show from her boots. So only she, or someone who undressed her, could see her socks. When Małgosia's parents' lawyer read the testimonies of the disco participants in 1997, she immediately picked up on this specific testimony and realized what she was looking at. She knew straight away that this guy was lying, that there was no couple having sex on stage because more people would have seen it. And she ran with this information to the prosecutor saying, "It must be him. The police have overlooked this detail in his testimony." But guess what? She got dismissed. She was told that this guy had already been checked and had nothing to do with the murder. Almost 20 years later, when Remik was reading the files, he couldn't believe that Irek was let off the hook so easily, almost as if someone helped him. So which Irek was it? Because there were a few Ireks I mentioned in the first episode, but it was so long ago that you have every right not to remember. So it was Irek with a bike. He was spotted by Małgosia's parents in the early morning hours of the 1st of January 1997 because they were surprised to see a young man riding aimlessly around the village when it was so cold and pitch dark. They wanted him checked. He was interrogated in 1997 and openly and without hesitation admitted that he was at the R family's yard many times on the night when Małgosia was murdered because he kept his bicycle and bottles of alcohol at that yard, hidden away from other disco participants. One of the R family's daughters had a boyfriend who happened to be friends with Irek's younger brother and thus knew Irek as well. The two of them met at a liquor store on the afternoon of 31st of December 1996. Irek was fuming. He just had a fight with his wife, who was angry that he spent a large portion of his wage on alcohol and came to her work drunk. So Irek decided he wouldn't be spending New Year's Eve night with his wife, who dared to piss him off. He wanted to go out instead. He met Paweł, one of the R girl's boyfriend, found out about the Miłoszyce disco, and this is how he ended up at the party. Beforehand, he purchased a few liters of alcohol, put it all in the basket of his bike, and kept all this at the R family's yard. When he finished one bottle, he would go and get the next one immediately, so he was shuttling there and back all night between the disco and the R family's yard. Irek also creeped out one girl from the R family when she was getting home after the disco with her boyfriend, Paweł, and Irek was following them. The girl got scared, she didn't know him, and Paweł calmed her down by reminding her that he knew Irek and that he was going with them to retrieve his bike from the yard. The couple went inside their home and didn't see Irek right away on his bike. It was at about 4 or 4:30 a.m. My question is, what was he doing from the moment he retrieved his bike to about 7 a.m. when Małgosia's parents were on their way to Miłoszyce and saw him? And another question is, how Remy's informant knew who to point at. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about Irek now, to show you the difference between him and Tomasz Komenda, and how one of them fits the profile of the murderer perfectly, when the other completely doesn't. If you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, you might want to look at the screen for a moment, because I'm going to show you a screenshot of Irek's record in the Public Sex Offender Registry. Here he is. Ireneusz Matuszak, born in 1975. At the time of the murder, he was 21 years old and already married, like I mentioned before. Seems like he wasn't too happy in his marriage, neither was his wife nor their 2 children, for Irek only loved 2 things in his life: alcohol and sex. And not in a fun, rockstar kind of way, no. When he drank, he would get more aggressive than normal, and he would hurt people, mostly women that he apparently hated. All of them. One could say that it's because of his rough childhood. His father died when Irek was a little kid, and his mom neglected him and his little brother, too busy with her sex worker career to raise her own children. The boys even had to spend some time in an orphanage, from which they were eventually taken by their grandma. The mother remembered at some point that she had 2 sons, and they sort of reconciled, but their relationship cannot in any way be called normal. Irek would live at his mother's from time to time, and the 3 of them, I mean him, his younger brother, and their mother, were drinking buddies, if I may call them this way. That would hardly ever end up well for the mother, who got beaten up by her son many times, but at the same time, she's probably the only woman in his life that he's never raped. Because the rest of them, from what I read, Irek seems like a complete Neanderthal to me. His needs are very basic: to get drunk and to get laid, regardless of whether his partner is willing to do either of those things, regardless of whether it's Irek's partner or a random woman. There is a long list of women he hurt in the past. One of them was even very likely killed by him at some point, but as of today it's impossible to prove that, especially because everybody at the scene was drunk, it was many years ago, and the woman was from a lower class and was an alcoholic. Irek, on the other hand, is most likely a sex addict. What's worse, in his view, women owe him sex and obedience. He loves showing his dominance over his victims. He humiliates them, he's very brutal during the attacks, and one of his signature moves is biting, severely, in a hurtful way. Irek would end up in prison many times for sexually assaulting women, but unsurprisingly, he was treated very mildly, and the harshest sentence he got, after many previous ones, was 6 years imprisonment. He felt pretty much immune, and why wouldn't he? And I want to stop here for a moment, because this situation shows a bigger problem known, I'm sure, not only in Poland, is the fact that even though the prosecutor in a rape case can ask for 15, 20 years or even life imprisonment, they hardly ever go for more than 5 years, whereas the judges tend to be even more lenient when making their final decision and sentence rapists for suspended sentences, like 1 year suspended for 3 years, 2 years suspended for 5, and so on. And I want it to be heard loud and clear. Those prosecutors and those judges are just as guilty as the actual rapist of the next crimes that rapist commits, because he feels he can and he won't ever be properly punished for it. You're just as guilty, and I hope you know it. This is exactly what happened here. Ireneusz Matuszak was never properly punished for brutally raping women. He would get out of prison and hurt more and more women just because he could, just because he wanted. And eventually, one night, He got drunk as per usual, got into a fight with his wife, which probably made him angry with women, went to a disco, spotted an easy victim, and raped her so brutally that she bled out to death, naked in the sub-zero temperatures. So again, I'm gonna say it, you, judges and prosecutors, who had not cared about treating victims fairly, who had not cared about protecting other women who had the misfortune of meeting Irek from getting hurt, you are just as guilty of what happened to Małgosia. Should you have incarcerated Irek for years after the first time he raped a woman? Should you have treated him as a dangerous beast that he was and sent him to a compulsory psychiatric treatment in due time, Małgosia would still be alive. And if that lenient approach towards rapists doesn't change, those situations will keep happening over and over again. But for that to change, you have to actually start caring for women and their safety. You have to acknowledge that there is a problem in society with a generally accepted violence towards women, violence that can always escalate and result in femicide, especially if combined with alcohol consumption or addiction. So, how do we know that it was in fact Irek who, on the 1st of January 1997, because bear in mind it was already after midnight, how do we know that it was he who approached Małgosia and Krzysztof, introduced himself as Małgosia's brother, and then took her to the our family's yard? Let's go over this in order in which Remik discovered the truth. So first, he gets this tip from a secret informant, which we already hate but have to deal with. We only know that this person came to Remik because he was not involved in the Miłoszyce case in any way. The informant had absolutely no trust in people who previously investigated the death of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. Remik started digging. He got access to the partially classified case files and looked Irek up in the police database. Discovered his past convictions, the fact that the guy was a serial rapist, and the fact that he lived a few kilometers away from Miłoszyce. Next thing Remik did was go to the National Public Prosecutor's Office, its branch in Wrocław to be specific, where he knew two prosecutors, one of them being the chief of the Wrocław NPP's office, and he told them what he found out. That a few years ago, he wanted to check a new lead in the Miłoszyce case and how he got dismissed. That people living in Miłoszyce approached him and wanted to talk about the case because nobody believed it was resolved. That he read those parts of the files that he had access to and pointed at things that, in his opinion, didn't add up. And that finally, he got a tip from his informant about the possible involvement of Ireneusz Matuszek in the murder, and having checked that, he was surprised to find out that not only was Matuszek interrogated and let go in 1997, but also that he was a well-known rapist and abuser with a criminal record. Those prosecutors that Remik spoke with, they knew him well. They knew what kind of cop he was. If he was saying that the case was most likely unresolved, and somebody should look into it once again, plus they remembered that it was speculated that there were 2 or 3 perpetrators and only one person was convicted, they trusted him. In the summer of 2016, the prosecutors started to work on the case along with Officer Remik. Having gotten access to the full case files this time, they quickly realized that this was gonna take more than 3 people to get through years and years of the investigations, which is why they added another prosecutor, a prosecutor's assistant, and 2 other police officers to their little, unofficial unit. Everyone noticed the socks thing in Irek's testimony. Somebody pointed out that it's odd that this guy didn't remember much from the night. Everything was kind of blurred to him due to the high alcohol consumption, but at the same time, he remembered the socks of the girl whom he had never seen before. That was the most detailed part of his testimony. He also fitted Remik's theory that it wasn't a local person who hurt Małgosia, because Irek lived a couple of villages away, but he was seen that night by at least a few people, as opposed to Tomasz Komenda, who had never been seen in Miłoszyce, and nobody remembered him. The new team of prosecutors and police officers figured that they could use the help of a criminal profiling specialist. During the first investigation in the 90s, one of the prosecutors had this idea too, but gave up on it since someone told him that a psychological profile of the perpetrator couldn't be done in this case, for whatever reason. So nobody actually looked into this. In 2016, however, the police had already been working for many years with Ms. Justyna Poznańska, a psychologist who, by many, is considered the best criminal profiler in Poland. So she described the main perpetrator as a man, aged between 17 and 30. the dominant and aggressive one among the group of 2 or more perpetrators. Most likely not in any way linked with the victims, since Małgosia was left still alive pretty much in plain sight, so he might have assumed that nobody was going to link him with the crime anyway, and he felt that he didn't need to hide anything. He's most likely poor, coming from a lower class, uneducated. Disorganized, he hurt Małgosia due to frustration and anger management issues, very likely under the influence of alcohol. He might have also been triggered earlier that night by some sort of stressful situation. He's either local or lives relatively close to the crime scene, since it seemed as though he knew the area where the crime was committed. Over time, he might develop, or already has developed, a liking for this kind of behavior. I don't know about you, but to me it sounds like a spot-on description of Ireneusz Matuszak. In 1996, he was 21. We already know he had a problem with anger management and he abused alcohol. Definitely not a scholar, a low-paid job, lived a few kilometers away from the crime scene. The night when Małgosia was murdered, he had a fight with his wife, which is why he decided to spend New Year's Eve away from home. And we also know that he hurt many women before and after the murder of Małgosia, so the profiler was right about him being or becoming a serial rapist. But the criminal profile of the perpetrator, as useful as it might be, can only be treated by the police as a clue on what direction the investigation should take. So the next step was re-examining all the evidence gathered during the investigation. It had to be done gently and thoroughly because it had been almost 20 years since the murder, and those pieces of evidence had already been examined quite a few times by many people. But there was still hope because the technological and scientific gap between 1997 and 2016 was enormous, so there was a chance that new evidence would still be found and possibly give answers to still unanswered questions, like who was at the crime scene. And bingo! The forensic lab specialists managed to find traces of blood and sperm on Małgosia's clothes and extract 139 DNA samples from them. The team of prosecutors and police officers working on the case immediately produced a sample of Matuszak's DNA to have it compared with the newly found DNA coming mostly from Małgosia's clothing. And guess what? Irek's DNA matched 27 samples. What's most important, his sperm was found on almost every piece of clothing the girl wore that night. It matters especially in court, since the DNA coming from blood or saliva is easier to explain. For example, the defendant might say that they cut themselves and a droplet of blood landed on the clothing of the victim, or that they spat somewhere nearby, which sounds quite innocent. Whereas the sperm, especially when it comes to a brutal sexual assault case, is much more incriminating and harder to explain. So, following the order of the evidence used to convict Tomasz Komenda, we have DNA, that's now incriminating Ireneusz Matuszak. Next should be the smell, but I believe that checking the smell from the crime scene wasn't possible at that point. Besides, the entire test carried out with Komenda and the way the smell samples were preserved were questionable. So the last thing to check when it comes to Ireneusz Matuszak would be his jaw prints. From what I read, it seems that even though he had a jaw cast made during the first investigation, it was very likely never compared with the prints left on Małgosia's body. His cast was found, but it had a name of a different person written on it, as if someone tried to make sure that Irek was never linked with the murder. Besides, it seemed that despite having made jaw casts of many men, only a few of them were compared with the pictures of Małgosia's body. Pictures that we know were not made properly. Bad angles, forensic rules put either too far away or too close to the prints. That's why, when the jaw prints were to be compared once again, the prosecutors gathered an entire scientific team for this job: an anthropologist, a forensic expert, a dentist, and a virtual engineer who created 2D and 3D computer models of Irek's jaw. The effort of the entire, let's call it dental team, paid off. After many tests, models, and calculations, the team concluded that all 3 wounds on Małgosia's body were made by one person, and that this person was Ireneusz Matuszak. But that wasn't all. Using the same methods and, this time, the right calculations, the team used this opportunity to compare the jaw cast of Tomasz Komenda with Małgosia's wounds, and there was no match. Tomasz Komenda was not responsible for the bite marks. One piece of the, what it seemed at the time of Komenda's trial, crowning evidence, was officially gone. The same with the DNA. There was no trace of Komenda's DNA at the crime scene. Whatever the forensic lab was able to find and extract from Małgosia's clothes and from the hairs found in the hat left right by her body was compared with Komenda's DNA using very advanced technology, compared with 1997. And he wasn't there. Not a single hair, no saliva, no blood, no sperm, no epidermis, nothing. Now my question is, would a 20-something-year-old man, struggling at school and working at a car wash, be able to beat and rape a young and fit girl who was defending herself, fighting for her life, without leaving any trace? Would he know about traces he could potentially leave behind? Would he remember to wear a tight hat so that he doesn't leave a single hair at the crime scene? Would he know to wear gloves? Would he know that he has to use a condom, especially when the other perpetrators did not use them? It was 1997. True crime books and podcasts weren't popular back then. Well, podcasts didn't even exist. But people generally didn't have access to or even interest in criminalistics. The only people who knew something about it were police officers and scientists. So having that in mind, I believe we can be positive that Komenda wasn't there. And if he wasn't there, then also his smell, which was the most controversial piece of evidence during the trial, also couldn't have been there. Which is what Remigiusz Korejwo and the prosecutors are pretty sure of today. That this entire smell test that the police carried out during the first investigation, where Komenda was taken to a town about 2 hours away from his home without having been told where he was going and why, they believe it was all a scam. The hat from which the scent was taken was either put on the backseat next to Komenda to soak up his scent, or, option number 2, the test was never really carried out. There has never been any video taken to record the test, or a report written on how the samples of the scent were taken and preserved. But it was still used in the court of law as evidence to prove that Komenda was at the scene and killed Małgosia Kwiatkowska. Getting back to Ireneusz Matuszak. It was about time to confront him with all the evidence gathered so far against him. It wasn't hard to find him. He was at his usual place, which is prison, where he was serving for his time for another rape. It was June of 2017, over 20 years after Małgosia died. Matuszak is a barator, a very bored and malicious person, and one of his hobbies is filing complaints against prison guards who, according to him, treat him poorly. I mean, I don't know, he's still alive, so more than fine in my opinion. So when the prosecutors from the NPP office in Wrocław had him over for the interrogation, he thought that they summoned him to listen to his whining about prison life. To his surprise, however, he was charged with yet another in his life, rape, and the murder of a 15-year-old girl, Małgosia Kwiatkowska. He acted just like any man accused of something he absolutely did. He got furious. And of course, he denied everything. He'd never seen the girl, he didn't do it. He heard about the story, but it wasn't him. He even started to add fictional and brutal elements to the story he allegedly only heard. Gossip about the way Małgosia was hurt using different objects like a glass bottle or a firework. Since Matuszak didn't have to confess to get officially arrested, and there was hard evidence that linked him with the murder, plus he didn't have anything interesting to say, the first meeting with the prosecutors ended rather quickly. Irek's situation didn't change drastically. After all, he was already behind bars, just for 2 different reasons this time. But to have him closer to the office and always at their disposal, the prosecutors filed a motion to have Irek transferred to the correctional facility in Wrocław. The next step was interrogating witnesses. Suddenly, after it turned out whose DNA was found on the crime scene, the police had an entire new group of people that they had never spoken with before, but who could have something to say either about Irek or the night of New Year's Eve 1996. All the key witnesses were interrogated on the same day when Irek was brought to the prosecutor's office and charged with murder. It was done so on purpose. Irek couldn't have contacted any of his friends or family to try and warn them before the interrogations, to ask them to testify in his favor or to threaten them to do so. He didn't know why he was going to Wrocław. There were no leaks in the press or TV that the Miłoszyce case was reopened, so everyone was taken by surprise, and that was the point. One of the first people interrogated by the investigators was Irek's mother's ex-partner, so kind of Irek's stepfather. He knew the case of Małgosia very well. He kept an eye on its development back in 1987. And why so? The answer is simple. This elderly man knew that from the beginning, the police were looking for a young man named Irek with a very specific hairstyle called mushroom haircut. The stepfather was trimming Irek's hair by himself, giving him the exact same haircut. He was suspecting that it could have been him, not only because of the name and the hair, but also because he knew Irek very well. He knew his attitude towards women, he knew about his alcohol and sex addiction, and how aggressive Irek had gotten when he got drunk. He also told the police that Irek would spike girls' drinks in order to abuse them afterwards. It was his thing. He did it many times. When a girl or a woman was half-conscious or even unconscious, he would brutally take what he believed all women owed him. He would also leave bruises and bite marks on their bodies. And there was one more thing. Irek's stepfather claimed that he remembered the morning of the 1st of January 1997 because of one weird event. He said he remembered Irek telling his wife to burn his pants, the pants he was wearing the previous night. Without any explanation, that was an order. For over 20 years, there was a person who had things like this to say about the guy named Irek, who was at the Alcatraz disco on the night when a girl was brutally raped and murdered. What's more, he suspected someone he knew of being a perpetrator of this crime, and yet he never came forward, never said anything. And why? Because he's never been asked a single question. Ireneusz Matuszak was never really a person of interest to the police regarding the death of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, so obviously nobody has ever thought of asking his family any questions about him. So many needed answers were there all the time. Irek's ex-wife was also interrogated. She told the police about her miserable marriage to a man who both mentally and physically hurt her many times. She was a victim of marital rape. She was hit regularly, even bitten. Again, his things for biting. Even though she was also pretty much the breadwinner of the family, since her husband preferred to spend his money on alcohol and parties instead of food for his wife and 2 children and rent. She went through a few years of hell with him. They met when she was 15. A year later, she got pregnant. She hadn't even graduated from high school when they got married. After that, it was just a survival mode. And that wasn't easy because Irek was always much stronger than her. This relationship was extremely dangerous to her, and I'm happy she got out of it and survived. I hope that the children are okay too. Regarding New Year's Eve of 1996, Irek's ex-wife remembered it well. Just to put that on a timeline for you, she was 18 at the time. A teenage girl with 2 children, a 2 and a 1-year-old. So she was utterly heartbroken with Irek's behavior, the fact that he had just gotten paid at work and had already wasted a lot of money on booze, then got drunk and made a scene at a grocery shop where she worked. He informed his wife that they would not be spending the New Year's Eve together, and she knew what that meant. That while she had to stay at home with their children, he'd go party somewhere, get even more drunk, and probably cheat. It was an early stage of their marriage, when she still cared about those things. She couldn't have known that cheating would be the lesser of 2 evils when it came to her husband's activities that night. Even though she was aware at that point, and said that to the police unasked, that Matuszak would ply women with drink until they were almost unconscious, and then he would abuse them sexually. So that's another person who confirmed that Irek used alcohol or other substances to rape women. The ex-wife didn't recall that Irek presented any odd behavior after the 1st of January 1987. To her, he acted as usual, came home in the morning, still drunk, loud and aggressive, probably woke the children up. When asked about the order Irek was supposed to give her to burn the pants that he was wearing, the woman was surprised. She was adamant that she would remember something so specific and so weird. She said that Irek never asked her anything like this. So the investigators got back to Irek's former stepfather, as stupid as it sounds, to confront his statement with what Irek's ex-wife said. The elderly man said he was still absolutely sure that Irek wanted someone to burn his pants, but he admitted that it could have been Irek's grandma who was told to do it, not his wife. Unfortunately, the grandma was long gone in 2017, so nobody could corroborate this testimony. The police managed to find one of Irek's old friends, a male. As it turned out, the police interrogated this person at the very last minute because he unexpectedly died that same year, in August 2017. This guy didn't have much to say about the events of the night when Małgosia was murdered, but he turned out to be an unexpected character witness. The ex-friend confirmed that he would visit Irek at home from time to time, and he noticed that Irek treated his wife poorly, by being verbally abusive to her, but also the friend noticed bruises on women's arms. I don't know if the friend tried to do anything with the fact that Irek seemed to have been violent towards his own family. I don't think so, because the friend also revealed that he found out from a third person that Irek would spike his own wife's drinks, partly to test if it works, partly to abuse her sexually, as if it wasn't enough when he was doing it when she was conscious. He would also do it to other random women. One of them will even be found later by the investigators and interrogated. So the friend knew about Irek's hobby. The stepfather knew about it, and then the wife knew that Irek liked making women unconscious. The only difference was that she thought he was doing it using only alcohol. So, many people knew, but nobody had ever said anything until 20 years later. Nobody ever came forward. At least 3 men in his life knew that Irek was hurting women. Women he knew and random ones, and they did nothing. They were okay with it. It was none of their business. Wondering if they would feel the same way if Irek spiked a drink of their wife or daughter. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if they were okay with that too. Once the third person testified that Irek used substances, there were 2 different ones mentioned, to spike women's drinks, the investigators realized that one information known from the very beginning of the case could have been understood incorrectly all this time. Many participants of the Alcatraz disco, including Małgosia's friends, testified in 1997 that she and a few other girls felt very sick that night. They would be stumbling, talking nonsense, vomiting, and acting weird in general, and we all know those symptoms. It looks like a typical alcohol poisoning, which would absolutely make sense if you were talking about a bunch of teenage girls at their first big party. Inexperienced, weighing usually less than boys, so able to safely consume much less alcohol than their male friends, no wonder that some girls felt sick that night. But was it alcohol? Małgosia's friends testified that she had about 1 beer, maybe less. So let's say about half a liter of beer and then some sparkling wine around midnight. And that's all. After she died, her blood was tested and it turned out that she had 0.9 per mile of alcohol in her blood at the time of her death, but 1.7 per mile in her urine. So for a 15-year-old girl to have about 2 per mile of alcohol in her system during a party, it seemed like a lot. At the same time, witnesses were all saying the same thing. Małgosia didn't drink much that night. The amount she drank, was it enough for her to be vomiting many times or to have trouble walking or standing up? The answer is, it depends. Now, there is a problem and explaining it will take a moment, so bear with me. 2 different substances were mentioned in the files of this case. I want to be socially responsible and I will not name any of them. If anyone's interested, they can find this out on their own. I'll just call them substances. And it turns out that one of them speeds up alcohol absorption, so much so that the body is able to soak up all alcohol from any alcoholic beverage within minutes. It just hits you, boom, and then you collapse. Some people add this substance to their own drinks on purpose to see if and how it works, to experiment. And it does work. Using that substance was part of Matuszak's MO when he wanted to assault a woman. But there was also another substance mentioned. The other one makes you super sleepy, gives you a headache, and from what I read, makes you feel like you've had too much of an anti-allergic med. You're drowsy, you're not really sure what's going on around you, and some people also collapse because they feel so bad. At the time, it wasn't easy to access the substance. However, it was known to have been used at clubs and discos in Wrocław by a group of bouncers, and it was supposed to work similarly to GHB. I'll get back to this part in a moment because, like I said, it's problematic. There was a possibility that Matuszak pretty much went on a hunt that night when Małgosia died, and spiked the drinks of a few girls, but it was Małgosia who turned out to be the least fortunate of all of them. She was probably observed the entire night and taken away from her friends exactly at the right moment. I mean, right for the predator. That version of events would match Irek's profile and MO, but checking this lead after so many years was hard. Not because it was technically impossible, but because to take samples and run a new toxicology report when the forensic expert knew what to look for this time, Małgosia's body had to be exhumed. At that point of the investigation, having gathered a lot of new evidence, it was time for Remik, the prosecutors, and their little unit, who tirelessly worked on the case, to inform the family of Małgosia Kwiatkowska that the case had been reopened and new discoveries had been made. The investigators had to tell grieving parents that the person whom, for the last 20 years, they thought was responsible for their daughter's brutal death was in fact innocent, even though, at the time of the trial, they were told that the defendant was 100% guilty of what he was charged. They spent over 20 years hating that one person who had taken away their happy family, their normal life, and, to some extent, their sanity. They couldn't wrap their heads around the concept of Tomasz Komenda being innocent, not after all this time, not after what they were told for so long. And I don't blame them. The family also found out that there was a new suspect. They always knew that there was more than one attacker, so hearing that someone else had finally been caught was probably a relief. However, I guess that finding out that this person was known to the police before in regard to this investigation, as well as many other brutal rape cases, must have been a hard pill to swallow. The worst part, however, was left for last. The investigators described Matuszak's MO and explained to the Kwiatkowski family that they would like to check whether Małgosia was under the influence of substances that could have been used to make her vulnerable and a bit more cooperative. They had to ask a mom and a dad who had already lost their child and had to bury it many years ago if they could dig up the child's body to run some tests because it took the police over 20 years to start asking the right questions and checking the right leads. These people have survived everything. The worst events any human can live through. The death of their daughter, then fighting for justice, constant grief, illnesses including cancer and stroke, and now this. By the way, the stroke that Mr. Kwiatkowski suffered happened shortly after he and his wife found out that the case had been reopened. But they said yes to the exhumation of Małgosia's body. They were willing to do whatever it takes to find out the truth about their daughter's death, even if that was the most painful thing in the world. They were ready to do it. So on the 10th of July 2017, a group of prosecutors, police officers, forensic lab workers, and the parents of Małgosia Kwiatkowska gathered at the cemetery in Jelczaskowice to witness the opening of the grave. The forensic team took samples of soil from around the coffin, and then the workers of a funeral home gently transferred the remains to a new coffin to have them sent away to the forensic lab and properly tested. A couple of weeks later, the same people gathered at the cemetery once again for the second funeral of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. It sounds like an absolute horror, but it really happened. It had to be done, and Małgosia's parents had to survive it. It was somewhat worth it though, because the toxicology report confirmed that Małgosia, in the moment of her death, was under the influence of one of the substances mentioned in the case files. After 20 years of wading in the soil, Małgosia's bones revealed at least a part of the truth about the night of the 31st of December 1996. She, and probably a few other girls, were drugged and observed by the predator the entire night. But only Małgosia was unfortunate enough not only to have met, but also to be left alone with a serial rapist. The problem I mentioned earlier is that the substance found in the bones of Małgosia Kwiatkowska wasn't the same substance that Ireneusz Matuszak usually used to spike women's drinks. He used substance number 1, whereas substance number 2, the one known to be used by the bouncers in clubs in Wrocław, was found in the grave. It does not mean that it couldn't have been Matuszak who spiked Małgosia's beer with a new-to-him substance. He could have obtained it either that night or earlier and observed how it worked. However, the police have never proven how and where he was supposed to get those pills. So there are 3 options I see here. Trigger warning, speculation. Option number 1. Matuszak got the new pills and used them for the first time, or at least the first time we know of, and the police couldn't prove it was him. Option number 2. Małgosia was targeted by 2 different predators that night, and her drink was spiked with 2 different substances, from which only one was found in her bones 20 years later because the other one is practically undetectable. It disappears in the system within minutes. Or option number 3. Matuszak didn't spike Małgosia's beer, but realized or was told that someone else had done it before him, so he decided to take advantage of the girl by taking her out of the party and then taking part in a group rape. So to sum up that part of the story, spiking the victim's drink fitted Matuszak's MO perfectly. That was one of his things, just like biting his victims. However, the substance that was used to do it wasn't the same substance that Matuszak usually used, but in theory, it was possible for him to obtain it and slightly change his MO. So the evidence gathered so far against Ireneusz Matuszak is as follows. The DNA from his sperm, the jaw prints left on Małgosia's body, the psychological profile of the murderer that fitted him perfectly, his history, he's a serial rapist convicted many times for brutally assaulting women, his MO, and the fact he was at the disco the night Małgosia died. And it's without a doubt. He was seen by many people, he never tried to conceal that, he had a perfect explanation for having repeatedly been at the yard where the body was later found. After he was charged with rape and murder, and then transferred from his previous jail to Wrocław, Matuszak underwent a 4-week mental health assessment. Knowing what we know about him now, the mental health assessment seemed like something long overdue in his case. As it turned out, however, Matuszak wasn't mentally ill or impaired. There was no central nervous system damage. He's perfectly healthy. The problem is his personality. The psychiatrist diagnosed him as a psychopath, which means he's an egocentric, treats other people like objects, and uses them as means to fulfill his own needs and desires. He's unable to feel love, empathy, or guilt. He's impulsive and in high need for stimuli and excitement in his life. And, according to psychiatrists, besides being a psychopath, Matuszak is also a sadist. He gets satisfaction from humiliating and hurting other people. When you think about it, that's quite a powerful combo. Terrifying, actually. A man, addicted to alcohol, for sure, and sex, probably. Looks quite big and strong. I saw some of his pictures from the trial. Those 3 combined would make me feel very uneasy around him. But to add psychopathy and sadism to this, and to think that this man was incarcerated for no more than 6 years at once, with 6 years being his longest sentence until the Miłoszyce case. I mean, Jesus. For so many years, this man was walking freely, and I'm wondering if there are more of his crimes that we don't know of yet. There could have been so many women, at least 1 dead, although probably 2. Were there more? I know I'm not the only person wondering about that. I know that Remik and the team from the National Prosecution Office were thinking about that too, which is why they started vetting Matuszak's entire past and interrogating women who started to talk. The investigators also looked into some old rape cases from the neighborhood to see if any of them fits his MO. After he split up with his wife, Irek started dating a woman he knew from school, and they would see each other in town from time to time. They both liked to party, and this is how they met again, in adult life. This woman was still very young and already a mother to 4 children, lived with her grandma, and allowed Irek to live with them too, because that was already the point where he didn't live with his own family, and he also got kicked out from his mother's place because of DV charges. He would beat his mother so severely that she finally called the police on her own son, which is something she'd never done before. So with Irek needing a place to crush, finding a girlfriend with whom he could move in together was a dream come true. However, this fairy tale didn't last long because, as we know, Irek was a rapist and he started to sexually abuse his partner. It would be in their apartment, also in the presence of other people. When the woman broke things off with Irek, he would still come over to her place and hurt her again because he was much stronger than her. He would even go as far as sort of kidnapping her, meaning he would come to her apartment and threaten her with beating her or death in order for her to follow him to his house. And she had to go, terrified and coerced into obedience. He'd be lurking outside, waiting for her and attacking even in public places. One day, she was walking with another girl, her best friend, and they were both attacked. He managed to hurt both of them before one of the women managed to escape and get to the police station. It's unbelievable that it actually happened. I cannot begin to imagine the horror of living like this in constant fear, probably disgust, and pain, both mental and physical, because Irek's attacks were always very brutal. They included beating, strangling, biting, making a woman bleed. Irek was so terrifying that this woman, his partner, and many others he hurt were scared to go to the police because they knew he would find out and knew they would be punished for it. Some of them went eventually, but as I said earlier, even if it got to trial and conviction, the verdicts would always be pathetic. He would get his biggest 6-year sentence after years and years of hurting women when the judge finally noticed that the no jail time verdicts or short time verdicts didn't seem to work on this particular specimen. But it was too little too late. During one of his trials, when he was charged with raping these 2 women I just talked about, at all costs I'm trying to avoid using their names, that's why it might sound so vague and unclear, and I'm so sorry for that. So in court, Irek said that it was all bullshit, that he never raped any of these women, but was in an official relationship with one of them, whereas the other one accused him of rape out of jealousy. Because according to him, he was such a catch that those 2 women were fighting for him. One lost, so as revenge, she accused him of terrible things. Innocent is probably Irek's favorite word. He'd always use it, no matter what he's accused of, no matter what evidence is there against him to support the charges. He's innocent. He's also a psychopath. He knows no remorse, and he truly, deeply, and down to the core, hates women. That's why every time he left jail, he'd return to it within a few weeks, charged with another rape, and had to wait for another trial. In 2014, he got arrested again after he hurt his new partner one too many times. The interesting thing is that the way this woman got abused was very similar to the way Małgosia Kwiatkowska was hurt. That included aggression, using fists, not only for hitting, severe biting, removing and destroying the clothes of the victim, and all this under a strong influence of alcohol. And even though the charges in this case were brought by one of the prosecutors who was in charge of the Tomasz Komenda trial, you remember there were about 5 prosecutors in this case? So one of those prosecutors who worked on both cases, Irek's new girlfriend and the Miłoszyce case, although not at the same time, did not notice the similarities and did not link the case of the serial rapist with the case of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. It was there, in plain sight, and nobody saw it. That's not all the women Remik and the prosecutors found out about during this investigation. I told you earlier about a woman pointed out by Irek's ex-friend, the male who died a few months after he was interrogated by the police. He died during a party. So the woman he talked about had her drink spiked and was raped, and the police managed to find her and convince her to tell what happened to her. The story fitted Irek's MO so perfectly that there was no doubt that it was him and that the woman was not lying. Besides, a psychologist was there to assess if the woman was making that up or if she was telling the truth, and according to the psychologist, the story was true. There was also a case of a 15-year-old girl who was attacked at night on her way home by 2 men. That already sounds almost exactly like what happened in Miłoszyce. The girl was abused by both men, and after the attack, one of the men left, and the other offered to walk her home. such a gentleman. On the way home, he heard her again. He had a bike, he was incredibly brutal, and the girl immediately recognized Matuszak in the pictures she was shown in 2017. The prosecutors added each case of rape and abuse that Irek committed throughout his entire life to the indictment act they prepared against him in the Miłoszyce case. I mean, as long as there was evidence to support the charges. Even though the statute of limitations already barred some cases. The prosecution still wanted all those cases merged into one trial to show the bigger picture, the true nature and the modus operandi of Ireneusz Matuszak, despite knowing that for some of those crimes, he couldn't be punished anymore. It's important to stress that all those cases of rape and abuse committed by Matuszak happened in one territory, and that it would be within 10 kilometers away from his home. I mean, both the home where he lived with his mother and the home where he lived with his wife and children for a couple of years. All those places, Jelczaskowice, Miłoszyce, Piekary, Oława, are all close to each other. It matters because, as you remember, they tried to convict Tomasz Komenda of another rape, the so-called Oława case. 2 women were attacked in August 1996. One of them got help from people who were nearby and she managed to escape, whereas the other woman was, just like in the previous case, hurt twice the same night by 2 different men. The first attacker was never caught. However, given that it was a brutal rape in the time when Matuszak was already active and it was in his territory, there is a possibility that he had something to do with it. Also, the woman remembered that the first attacker was blonde and drove a white Fiat 126P. I don't know if Matuszak had any car. By all accounts, he was using a bicycle, but he was blonde. Besides, it was said, and that was the reason why Komenda was charged for this rape in the first place, it was said that DNA collected from the clothes of the victim from Oława, the one who was hurt twice the same night, and the DNA found in Miłoszyce belonged to one person. But then again, those samples were tested using the polymarker method, so I'm not really sure how credible they are. It would be perfect if the investigators had a chance to run the test once again. In theory, Matuszak could be the perpetrator in the Oława case, the one that Komenda initially got convicted for and then thankfully acquitted, but as of today, we have absolutely no proof that this is what happened. So the list of charges against Ireneusz Matuszak was piling up, and in the meantime, the forensic lab was comparing the DNA profiles found at the crime scene in Miłoszyce with the DNA samples taken from, I believe, hundreds of now adult men who either were at the disco and got called to the police station to be interrogated once again many years after the first investigation, or, in theory, had nothing to do with the Alcatraz disco, but for other reasons were of police's interest regarding this case. I guess it's about the ex-cons living in the area. It was already known at that point that at least 3 people took part in the attack on Małgosia because the DNA of 3 different people was found at the crime scene, mostly on Małgosia's clothes. It only confirmed the initial theory, known back in 1997, that there could have been 3 or 4 attackers that night, but only one person was convicted. And as it turned out, wrongfully. It was about time to fix that, so while the scientists were working in the lab, hoping for another DNA sample match, our little unit, consisting of the police officers and prosecutors who decided to reopen the Miłoszyce case, was working on the motion to release Tomasz Komenda from jail. Of course, the motion had to be backed up by solid evidence. At that point of the investigation, our prosecutors and police officers had 2 pieces of evidence at their disposal: the DNA samples from the crime scene and the fact that none of them matched the DNA profile of Tomasz Komenda, plus the jaw prints from Małgosia's body that had been confirmed to belong to Matuszak, not Komenda. The investigators also had testimonies of Komenda's friends and family from 1997. About a dozen of people testified that Komenda spent the New Year's Eve night of 1996 in Wrocław. There was a party in his family's apartment. He never left that place except for the 10 minutes of watching the fireworks show at midnight, but then the entire crew was with him and they went back in together. But the prosecutor, who brought charges against Tomasz Komenda, didn't want to listen to the witnesses corroborating Komenda's alibi. He said that, in his opinion, they were lying to protect their son, brother and friend, and then threatened that if the witnesses kept saying that Komenda was in Wrocław that night, then he, the prosecutor, was going to charge them with false testimony. And then we have 2017. There's another suspect, Matuszak, who 100% and without a doubt was at the Alcatraz disco, never tried to deny it. What's more, he went to the R family's yard multiple times that night. And the police back then just let him go. Just like that. Quite a juxtaposition of suspects and the way they were treated, isn't it? Tomasz Komenda found out about the reopening of the Miłoszyce case from TV in June of 2017. I don't like that was the way he was informed, but shortly after that information was released to the media and the public opinion found out that there was a new suspect, Komenda was visited in jail by the police officers reinvestigating the case. His first words were, "Guys, I've been waiting for you for 17 years. Unfortunately, he had to wait a little longer because the entire procedure of releasing him took about a year. Tomasz Komenda was brought to the prosecutor's office in Wrocław and once again told the story of New Year's Eve 1996. Answering all the questions took about 4 hours and cost him a lot. I'm trying to imagine the mixture of hope and fear he must have felt at that point. He was telling the truth, but didn't know if he was believed. He was, by the way. The investigators knew he had nothing to do with the killing of Małgosia, but they also knew that releasing Komenda was not up to them, but to the court. They didn't want to give him any false hope. All they could do was prepare a motion to the district court in Wrocław to have him released from prison and then another motion to the Supreme Court for acquittal. Both had to be backed up by as solid evidence as possible. That's why Komenda underwent countless tests, experiments, assessments, including a psychological assessment, a polygraph test, meaning a lie detector test. Then they interrogated Komenda's family and the participants of the New Year's Eve party. All this to prove that he did not kill Małgosia despite the claims of the police, prosecution, judges, and the media from 17 years before. It was the 15th of March 2018 when Tomasz Komenda, along with his entire family and the investigative unit that reopened the Miłoszyce case, stood in the courtroom about to hear the district court's decision on releasing Tomasz Komenda from jail. The prosecutors who filed the release motion were pretty sure that this was going to work because they pretty much asked for a prison leave, a break in serving his time. The reasoning behind it was simple. Getting a prison leave shouldn't be hard in a case like this because if for any reason it turned out that Tomasz Komenda was guilty after all, the leave would simply be ended and Komenda would be back in prison in no time. At the same time, the period during which Komenda would be on prison leave would suffice for the Supreme Court to acquit Komenda and he wouldn't have to wait for this most important verdict behind bars. So everybody's in the courtroom, waiting impatiently for the judge to rule that Tomasz Komenda is allowed to take a break in serving his time for the murder, when suddenly everybody hears there are no grounds in this case to order a prison leave. To be continued.